Welcome to Coffee and Regs, a CSS RegTech podcast series on moving from a tactical to strategic approach to regulatory compliance.
Hi, this is Natalie Silverman for CSS. Welcome to our next episode of Coffee and Regs. On today's episode, we're recapping the 2021 cybersecurity landscape and crystal ball gazing to predict what's next for 2022. Please welcome our cybersecurity experts, Yerzak and Mike Farrell. Good morning, EJ and Mike, and thanks for sitting down for Coffee and Regs.
Thank you, Natalie. To recap 2021, it was a very interesting year in terms of cybersecurity. Certainly no shortage of headlines, no shortage of cybersecurity incidents making the rounds. And what we've seen in 2021 really was a continuation of some of the attack vectors that started in 2020, with workforces shifting to a work from home / remote work sort of strategy. As firms began moving their staff back to the office or operating in sort of a hybrid model, or in some cases, continuing to have their staff work remotely, what we saw was a continued increase in the use of cloud-based services. Now, the use of cloud-based services is fantastic in terms of business continuity, in terms of being able to access your data from just about anywhere, but it does present some continued challenges when we're talking about ransomware. Ransomware can impact firms regardless of where their data is, and ransomware attacks really shifted from an attack vector that primarily focused on locking down a firm's files to a more exfiltrate and extort strategy in 2021. So what we saw in 2021 was a vast increase in the number of cyber attacks that resulted in ransomware, and also a number of successful cyber attacks stemming from ransomware. In June 2021 alone, ransomware attacks had spiked almost 1,000% compared to the same time the prior year. And that is an astounding number. That is an incredible amount of ransomware attacks that are occurring in the wild. Europe led the charge in terms of the volume of ransomware attacks in 2021. The United States was, not too far behind, and both Europe and the United States constituted a number of ransomware attacks that were above and beyond those impacting many other countries and regions. We've seen, government sectors be targeted. We've seen automotive sectors targeted, but increasingly we're seeing managed service providers be targeted in ransomware attacks. If you think about it, it sort of makes sense. The hackers have grown wiser, and they're targeting the data where that data resides. They're realizing that with all these companies working remotely, many of them are using the same cybersecurity vendors at the end of the day. So these cybersecurity vendors are providing the same services to many, many firms out there across the world. And it's sort of the weak link. And I'm not saying that these particular firms that had cyber attacks in 2021 are necessarily weak links all the time, but it's a weak link in the chain in terms of a concentration of exposure. And hackers realize they can get a lot of bang for their buck by targeting that aspect of the funnel. We saw this happen in 2021 with specific attacks against SolarWinds and against Kaseya. Again, leading cybersecurity vendors used by many, many firms. These particular cyber attacks really highlighted the importance of conducting vendor due diligence, both initially and on an ongoing basis for your service providers, particularly in the wake of any cybersecurity incidents. Really just to find out at the end of the day, were your particular vendors impacted by these cyber attacks? Did you experience any data loss from these cyber attacks, or did the parties that you use and outsource services to have any exposure to these? So again, vendor due diligence remains an incredible control to have in place to really stay abreast of how these increased cyber attacks are potentially impacting your own data, your own client data. Third point I want to mention in terms of recapping 2021 and looking ahead in our crystal ball to what 2022 may bring for us. The cybersecurity workforce continues to be in high demand. You can ask just about any company out there right now if they're hiring for cybersecurity, and they're going to tell you yes. ISACA recently conducted a survey, found that 61% of cybersecurity teams are understaffed. Many, many firms are experiencing hiring challenges, trying to find qualified, competent cybersecurity professionals because, as we mentioned, the cyber attacks are rising exponentially and firms are just struggling to keep up. They're struggling to keep up with the attacks that were in place in 2020. So in 2021, trying to keep up with the increased number of attacks, you can see how that math just doesn't add up. And so we need more cybersecurity professionals in the workforce to be able to heed this challenge. I'm going to segue it over to my colleague, Mike Farrell, to talk about some of the ways that the SEC is focusing on cybersecurity.
Thanks, EJ. So every year the SEC has to submit their annual performance report in support of the following year's budget. So when they released 2020's performance report earlier this year, they noted that during 2020, even with the pandemic and the shift to remote working, the SEC still managed to conduct more than 370 examinations, specifically requesting information related to firms' information security programs, their policies, procedures, results of any kinds of testing that they're doing. It seems like a pretty clear path forward that the SEC is only going to be able to continue expanding its examination, not even necessarily just the number of firms, but their actual testing capabilities. As we saw over the last 10 years or so when they were building out their trade blotter analytics, their NEAT tool. They're going to continue to get more and more sophisticated. The longer they're able to go in and work with firms, review their programs, their capabilities for proving some of the stats that we read about, proving that you have password controls in place, or that you have conducted proper due diligence on all of your vendors, especially your high-risk vendors. I see the SEC's exam numbers ticking upwards in the information security and cybersecurity areas, especially going into next year.
Those are great points, Mike. I think, as we look in the crystal ball at what 2022 may bring for cybersecurity, one thing that comes to mind for me is cyber insurance. And speaking with a number of firms about their own cyber insurance, capabilities and policy changes, what I've seen in 2021 that I expect will continue into next year is a maturing of these cyber insurance policies. In some respects, I've seen the number of carriers out there offering cyber insurance has consolidated. Fewer and fewer firms are offering cyber insurance. Now, whether or not that means that some carriers have completely folded or have just abandoned the cyber insurance market and left it to the other firms, perhaps they've had to pay out a huge amount of claims in the wake of all these cyber attacks, and they simply couldn't remain a viable company. That's certainly a possibility. Those firms that remain out there offering cyber insurance coverage, I've heard both sides of the coin here. I've heard some firms saying that, hey, my cyber insurance policy is twice as expensive now than it was before. Other firms are saying that, hey, the cyber insurance landscape has gotten more competitive and I've actually been able to save on my cyber insurance coverage. So I suspect that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I do think it's accurate to say that the number of cyber insurance policies and cyber insurance coverage offered through carriers out there has decreased just in terms of the number of carriers out there that are able to stay in business offering these policies, particularly as you have to pay out millions and millions of dollars dealing with successful cyber attack claims. One thing to keep in mind, as you revisit your cyber insurance policies in 2022, look at the fine print. Take a very close look at those policy, inclusions and exclusions. Something like a successful ransomware attack launched by nation-state actors may actually be deemed an act of war under your cyber insurance coverage. So that could fall under an exclusion, and you might think you have coverage for ransomware. Lo and behold, a cyber insurance carrier may come back and say, no, I'm sorry, this attack actually was part of a larger, broader scale attack launched from, Russia or North Korea or, some other nation state sponsored attack, and it might not be covered. So pay very close attention to the fine print. It does remain a good control to have, though, to have cyber insurance coverage. It gives you peace of mind, and it will cover most of the situations that are likely to occur. But again, just be mindful that there are going to be some situations that may fall outside. When it comes to cyber insurance coverage, though, and continuing that theme, I think many carriers are getting better at evaluating the risk of the firms, during the underwriting stage. The ways in which they do that are asking more and more detailed questions about the types of testing that firms are doing, whether or not they've found any vulnerabilities through that testing, whether they've remediated those vulnerabilities, and whether firms have, comprehensive risk-based cybersecurity programs reasonably designed. So similar to what the SEC is asking, as Mike mentioned, when they're conducting these examinations of registered investment advisors, the cyber insurance carriers are asking very similar questions, trying to understand the risk profile of these firms. So as we look into 2022, I suspect we're going to see a continuation of the same themes. Now, Mike mentioned that the SEC is focusing very carefully on, investment advisors' information security controls. Fortunately for our listeners here, we have Dan Call with the SEC joining us for a fireside chat on December 2nd. So we'll be able to hear firsthand from Dan exactly how he views the SEC heading into 2022. And please join us for that. It'll be interesting to hear, straight from the SEC what 2022 may portend for us.
Thanks, Mike and EJ, for the insight into how you like your regs in the morning. For CSS, this is Natalie Silverman.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs, a CSS RegTech podcast series. Make sure you catch every episode by subscribing to our podcast on www.cssregtech.com or through your podcast platform of choice. Thanks so much for tuning in. This podcast is brought to you by Compliance Solutions Strategies and is for general information purposes only. All rights reserved.